After 5 years of living in my house, my son and his wife won $75 million in the lottery. That same day, she pushed me out the door. Get out to a nursing home. We don't need your pity. I smiled. Dear, did you check the name on the ticket? Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think that a house full of family was the greatest gift a woman could ask for in her old age. I was wrong. My name is Margaret Harlow. Most people call me Maggie. I am 68 years old, a retired school teacher, and for 31 years I lived in the same white clapboard house on Elm Creek Road in Denton, Ohio. My husband Gerald built the back porch with his own hands. He died of a heart attack in the driveway in the spring of 2016, and after that, it was just me, the house, and the sound of the wind through the oak trees he planted the year we got married. For 3 years after Gerald's death, I managed fine on my own. I had my pension, my garden, my neighbor Ruth, and enough sense to know that loneliness and helplessness are not the same thing. But when my son Daniel called me in the fall of 2019 and said that he and his wife Christine had hit a rough patch financially, his contracting business had slowed, they'd fallen behind on rent, I didn't hesitate. Come stay with me, I said. This house is too big for one person anyway. That was my first mistake. Not loving my son. That was never a mistake. The mistake was not asking more questions about Christine. She arrived with her chin already lifted at a slight angle, as if the air inside my house required evaluation before she chose to breathe it. She was 34, sharp-featured, with a talent for compliments that somehow left you feeling diminished. What a cozy little place, she said, the first afternoon, looking up at the 12-foot ceilings in the living room. I smiled and showed her to the guest room, which I had repainted and furnished with a new mattress the week before their arrival. In those first months, it was manageable. Daniel helped me with the yard. Christine contributed to groceries sometimes. We had dinners together on Sundays. I told myself it was working. But I had been a teacher for 34 years, and teachers learn to read the room. By the second year, I noticed the small things. Christine rearranged my kitchen without asking. She moved Gerald's photograph from the mantel to a shelf in the hallway. When I put it back, she moved it again. She referred to the house as our place on the phone with her friends. She complained about my television habits, my cooking smells, the hour at which I woke up. Daniel said nothing. He had always been a gentle soul. Too gentle, Gerald used to say, though he meant it with love. By the third year, Christine had stopped knocking before entering my bedroom. By the fourth, she had begun to speak to me in the particular tone reserved for children and the senile. Slow, over-enunciated, with a bright, artificial smile. I said nothing. I watched. That is also something teaching had given me. Patience. Then, in the spring of 2024, I did something I had never done in my life. I bought a lottery ticket. Not out of desperation. I am not that kind of woman. I bought it because Ruth dared me to at the gas station on Route 9, and because it cost $2, and because sometimes at 68 you do small, foolish things just to feel the possibility of something unexpected. I bought 2 tickets. I kept one. On impulse, on pure passing generosity. I gave the second one to Daniel as he walked through the kitchen that evening. He thanked me without looking up from his phone. I forgot about it. 3 weeks later, the world changed. Daniel had checked his ticket, the one I gave him, and discovered 5 matching numbers and a bonus ball. The prize was $75 million. The house became something I didn't recognize. There were phone calls, lawyers, a financial advisor who arrived in a suit that cost more than my car. Christine floated through the rooms with a brightness that had nothing to do with joy and everything to do with power. She bought new furniture and had it delivered before asking me. She spoke of investments and properties and our future with a frequency that excluded the word we entirely. I watched all of it from my kitchen table, drinking my morning coffee, and I felt something cold and quiet settle in my chest. And then came the morning it happened. It was a Tuesday. I remember that. I was standing at the kitchen counter slicing an apple when Christine walked in wearing a silk robe I'd never seen before, poured herself coffee from my pot, and said, without turning to look at me, "Maggie, we've been talking. You'd probably be more comfortable somewhere with people your own age. There's a very nice assisted living place on the other side of Denton. We'd cover the cost, of course." I set down the knife. I looked at her. She turned, finally, and her expression was not unkind, which was almost worse. It was the expression of someone doing the reasonable thing. "This is my house," I said. Something crossed her face then. The mask slipped. "Not for much longer," she said, and her voice was quiet and utterly certain. "We don't need your charity anymore, Maggie. We don't need you. Pack what you need." Daniel agrees. She walked out of my kitchen, the room where I had taught my son to make pancakes on Saturday mornings, where Gerald and I had sat on the last night of every year, drinking cider and talking about the one ahead. I stood there for a long moment, then I smiled. Because Christine had made one catastrophic error, and she didn't know it yet. She had never once asked me about the other ticket. I walked down the hallway to my bedroom, closed the door, and sat on the edge of Gerald's side of the bed. That is where I always went when I needed to think clearly. His side. The pillow had lost his smell years ago, but the habit remained. And sometimes habit is all that holds you together. I sat there for a long time. Let me be honest about what I felt in those first minutes, because I think honesty is the only thing worth offering at this point in the story. I felt afraid. Not the sharp, dramatic fear of crisis, but the dull, grinding fear of the elderly and powerless. The fear that the world has quietly reorganized itself around you while you weren't looking, and that no one intends to tell you. I was 68 years old. I had a pension of $1,900 a month. My car was a 2014 Honda Civic with a slow leak in the left rear tire, and the two people I had sheltered, fed, and tolerated for 5 years had just informed me, with the calm efficiency of a business transaction, that my presence was no longer required. Was I surprised? Part of me was not. The signs had been there for 2 years, accumulating like water under a floorboard. But knowing a flood is coming does not make the water less cold. I made myself think practically. It was the teacher's instinct. When emotion threatens to overwhelm, reach for structure. I owned the house. That was the first fact. The deed was in my name, Margaret Ann Harlow, registered at the Denton County Clerk's office. I had bought this house with Gerald in 1991, and when he died, it passed to me entirely. No one had asked me to sign anything. No one had offered me money for it. No one had the legal right to remove me from it. Christine's declaration, not for much longer, was not law. It was threat. But threats from people with $75 million are not the same as threats from people without. I thought about that. I thought about what money could do. Lawyers, delays, harassment, pressure. I had read enough in the news to know that wealth changed the geometry of any dispute. They could make my life miserable even without any legal ground. They could contest my mental competency. They could claim I was no longer able to maintain the property. They could simply make living here so unpleasant that I chose to leave on my own. Had Christine already thought of that? Probably. She was not a stupid woman. She was a calculating one, which is more dangerous. I sat with the fear until it became something I could hold at arm's length. Then I got up, went to the small desk in the corner of my room, Gerald's desk, a roll top he'd inherited from his father, and opened the bottom left drawer. The lottery ticket was there, inside a plain white envelope, exactly where I had placed it 3 weeks ago, and then forgotten. I took it out. I looked at it. The numbers were printed in black ink on thin paper. 7 digits that corresponded, I now knew for certain, to a prize of $75 million. Because the ticket I had given Daniel was ticket number 2, the duplicate, and this was ticket number 1. Same drawing, same purchase, same register receipt still folded in the back of my wallet. Here is what no one in that house knew. In Ohio, a lottery prize belongs to the named claimant on the submitted ticket. You cannot claim a prize on a ticket you did not purchase unless ownership is legally established. I had purchased both tickets. I had the receipt. I had not signed the ticket I gave Daniel, and he, in his excitement, had not yet submitted it for official processing. He had a lawyer looking into it. That much I'd overheard through the wall, which meant there was still time. I knew I needed help, not family. Family had just demonstrated its value. I needed someone with legal knowledge and no stake in being polite about what I was facing. I picked up the phone and called Ruth. Ruth Calloway had been my neighbor for 22 years and my closest friend for most of them. She was 71, drove a truck, grew tomatoes that made mine look apologetic, and had zero patience for nonsense of any variety. She answered on the second ring. "Maggie, you never call before noon unless something's wrong." "Something's wrong," I said. I told her everything. The ticket, the scene in the kitchen, Christine's words, the $75 million, my ticket in the bottom drawer. I spoke steadily, without drama, the way I'd learned to report difficult things to parents at school conferences. When I finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you have a lawyer?" "Not since we closed on the house in '91. My nephew David is in family and property law in Columbus. He's good, and he doesn't waste time. Can I call him today?" "Yes," I said. "Don't tell Daniel or Christine anything," Ruth said. "Not one word. If they ask where you're going or who you're talking to, you're visiting a friend or you're running errands. Can you do that?" "I taught middle school for 34 years, I said. "I can keep a secret from a 34-year-old. Ruth laughed, and for the first time since that morning, something in my chest loosened slightly. The plan was simple at this stage. Barely a plan at all, just a direction. Find a lawyer. Establish what I actually owned and what rights I actually held. Then determine the question that had been circling in my mind since I looked at that ticket. Was it too late to act, or was there still time to change what was about to happen? I tucked the ticket back in the envelope. I put the envelope in my coat pocket. I went to the bathroom, washed my face with cold water, looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. I was not a woman who had ever needed rescuing. I did not intend to start now. 2 days later, I drove to Columbus. I told Christine I was visiting an old colleague from my teaching years, which was close enough to the truth that I felt no particular guilt about it. She didn't press me. She was on a video call with a real estate agent when I left. Walking through virtual tours of properties I suspected she was already imagining as hers. Daniel was in the garage. He lifted 2 fingers in a wave as I backed down the driveway. I waved back. The drive to Columbus was an hour and 20 minutes on Route 33. I listened to a public radio program about migratory birds and felt, for stretches of highway, almost peaceful. Ruth's nephew, David Calloway, had his office on the fourth floor of a modest building near the Short North District. He was 39, methodical, with the particular calmness of a man who had heard a great many versions of family crisis and was no longer surprised by any of them. He offered me coffee, and I accepted, and then I put the lottery ticket on his desk along with the gas station receipt and explained the situation without editorializing. He examined both items carefully. He asked several questions. When had I purchased the tickets? Had I signed either ticket? Had Daniel signed the ticket in his possession? Had any formal claim been filed with the Ohio Lottery Commission? I answered each question in order. No, I had not signed either ticket. No claim had been filed yet. Daniel's attorney was still preparing the documentation, pending financial advice about tax structuring. David was quiet for a moment, studying the receipt. "This receipt shows 2 tickets purchased in sequence," he said. "With your card." He looked up at me. "You could establish purchase provenance. In Ohio, unsigned lottery tickets are legal bearer instruments, meaning ownership is based on possession and purchase evidence. But you've given 1 ticket voluntarily to your son. That complicates the picture." "Does it eliminate my claim?" I asked. "Not necessarily. You gave him a ticket as a gift, but the gift of a physical ticket and the gift of the winnings attached to it are 2 different legal questions, especially if the ticket was purchased with your funds and no documentation of the transfer of beneficial interest exists." He paused. "The more immediate issue is this. If he files that ticket for a prize claim, before you take any legal steps, the commission will process it and the money will move. Once that happens, recovery becomes exponentially harder." "How long before they can file?" "Claims on prizes of this size require original ticket submission and identity verification. His attorney needs to complete the tax structuring first, which typically takes 2 to 3 weeks in cases like this. My guess, you have 10 days, possibly 2 weeks, before they submit." 10 days. What do I do? David set down his pen. "First, I draft a legal notice, a letter asserting your ownership interest in the ticket and notifying the Ohio Lottery Commission of a disputed claim. This doesn't freeze the prize, but it creates an official record before any claim is filed. Second, we document everything: the purchase receipt, your bank statement showing the card transaction, a sworn affidavit from you about the circumstances." He looked at me carefully. "This will not be invisible. When they receive the notice, Daniel and Christine will know." "I know," I said. "Are you prepared for that?" I looked down at the ticket on his desk. $2 of thin paper that had somehow become the axis around which everything in my life was turning. I thought about Gerald's porch. I thought about Christine moving his photograph. I thought about the particular tone of her voice. "We don't need you." "Yes," I said. "I'm prepared." David began typing. He pulled up the Ohio Lottery Commission's dispute notification protocol and walked me through it. He showed me the form used to assert a competing ownership claim prior to official prize submission. He explained that a notice filed in advance created a legal paper trail that would require the commission to acknowledge the dispute before releasing funds. It was not a guarantee. It was a flag planted in the ground. Then he showed me something else, something that made the room feel very quiet. He had searched the commission's public filing database while we spoke. Daniel's attorney had submitted a preliminary registration of intent to claim, a standard procedural step, 48 hours earlier. They had already started. "They're moving faster than expected," David said. "Christine," I said simply. He nodded. He understood without requiring elaboration. "Then we file today," he said. He prepared the notice that afternoon. I signed the affidavit. He notarized it. By 4 o'clock, the letter was sent by certified mail and electronic submission to the Ohio Lottery Commission's legal department, asserting that Margaret Ann Harlow, as the purchaser and original holder of both lottery tickets issued in transaction number 447-9182-C at the Rudders gas station on Route 9 in Denton, Ohio, maintained a legal ownership interest that had not been formally transferred, and requesting that no prize disbursement be made pending resolution of the dispute. David walked me to my car. "They will be angry," he said. "Yes," I said. "Are you safe at home?" I thought about that honestly. "They won't be physically dangerous," I said. "Christine is ruthless, not violent. And Daniel has never raised his voice to me in his life." "Call me if anything changes," he said. He gave me his cell number. "Don't discuss the case with them. If they confront you, say only that you're getting legal advice. You don't owe them details." I drove home in the late afternoon light, past fields going gold and flat, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not fear, but a deep and steady clarity. I had planted the flag. Now I would see who came to pull it up. I turned onto Elm Creek Road, pulled into the driveway, turned off the engine. The lights were on in every room of the house. I had not yet taken my coat off. I was still standing in the entryway, keys in hand, when Christine appeared at the end of the hallway. She was holding her phone, and her expression was the kind that has moved past anger into something colder and more deliberate. "We need to talk," she said. Daniel appeared behind her a moment later. He looked the way he had as a boy when he'd broken something. Not so much guilty as afraid of what came next. I hung up my coat. I set my keys on the hook Gerald had installed by the door in 1994. Then I turned and walked into the living room and sat in my chair. Gerald's armchair, dark green, which Christine had twice tried to replace with something more modern. And I looked at them both and said, "All right." Christine sat on the edge of the couch. Daniel stood near the window. He couldn't quite hold my gaze. "We received a call from our attorney this afternoon," Christine said. Her voice was controlled, the way it always was when she was working hardest at composure. "Apparently, the Lottery Commission received a legal notice claiming a competing ownership interest in Daniel's ticket." She paused. "In your name." "Yes," I said. The single syllable seemed to land harder than she expected. "Maggie." Daniel's voice was strained. "What are you doing? That was a gift. You gave me that ticket." "I gave you a piece of paper," I said. "I didn't sign an agreement. I didn't file a transfer of ownership. I have the purchase receipt with my card number, and both tickets were bought in the same transaction." "That is not how gifts work," Christine said. "That is exactly how bearer instruments work under Ohio law," I said. David had given me those words specifically. I had practiced them in the car. Christine's jaw tightened. "This is a legal stunt. You're trying to steal money that belongs to us." I looked at her. "You told me 2 days ago to pack my things and leave my own house," I said. "You said you don't need my charity. So I decided to take your advice and stop being charitable." Silence. Then Christine leaned forward. Her voice dropped into a register I hadn't heard from her before. Not quite a threat, but the shape of one. "Maggie, you have no idea what you're starting. We have resources now. We can tie this up in litigation for years. We can file a counterclaim. We can challenge your cognitive competency. At your age, a judge might be very interested in whether you're capable of making sound legal judgments." She let that land. "Or we can make this go away quietly, right now. You drop the notice. We give you a generous allowance and you stay in the house as long as you want. Comfortable, taken care of." The room was quiet. Outside, a car passed on Elm Creek Road. I thought about the word comfortable. I thought about what it would mean to accept money from Christine, to become a dependent in my own home, tolerated, maintained, kept. The allowance would be a leash. The kindness would be a performance. And the first time I disagreed with her about anything, I would feel the length of the chain. No, I said. Mom. Daniel moved away from the window. His voice cracked slightly. Please. This is our family. This isn't worth. You stood in this kitchen 2 days ago, I said quietly. While your wife told me to go to an assisted living facility, you said nothing. You agreed. I looked at him steadily. I don't know what this family is anymore, Daniel, but I know what this house is. It's mine. Christine stood up. For a moment, I thought she might actually say something honest, might drop the architecture of composure and speak plainly. But instead, she straightened her shoulders and said, You'll regret this, and walked out of the room. Daniel lingered. He looked old to me in that moment, in a way he hadn't before. Tired and caught between two loyalties and not quite brave enough to honor either cleanly. I'm sorry, he said. I wasn't sure what he was apologizing for. Good night, Daniel, I said. He went upstairs. I sat in Gerald's chair for a long time after that, not moving. The threat about cognitive competency had been designed to frighten me, and it had a little. That was the most insidious kind of threat, the kind that uses your own vulnerabilities against you. I was 68. I lived alone in my routines. I was eccentric in the way of people who have stopped editing themselves for company. A clever attorney with the right framing could plant doubt. But doubt is not evidence. And I had a receipt, a bank statement, a notarized affidavit, and David Calloway. Over the next 3 days, I let myself rest. I slept. I read. I sat on Gerald's porch in the October cold with a blanket and a thermos of coffee and watched the oak trees lose their leaves. I did not engage with Daniel or Christine beyond the surface courtesies of shared space. I texted David each morning with any new developments. There were none. On the third day, I felt the fear recede far enough that I could see past it. I was not comfortable. I was not safe in the easy sense of the word. But I was clear. And clear, I had learned a long time ago, was enough to work with. On the fourth morning after the confrontation, Christine came downstairs and made me breakfast. That was how I knew the strategy had changed. She set a plate of scrambled eggs and toast on the table in front of me without a word, poured us both coffee, and sat down across from me with a small, careful smile. The silk robe was gone. She was wearing something ordinary, a gray cardigan I'd seen before, and her hair was pulled back simply. She had, I realized, studied how to appear less threatening. I want to apologize, she said. For the other night. I was cruel, and I shouldn't have been. I looked at the eggs. They were well made, properly seasoned, not overcooked. Christine was, among other things, a competent cook when she chose to be. Thank you for breakfast, I said. Maggie. She folded her hands on the table. I know we've been difficult to live with. I know I haven't always been kind. But we're family. And I've been thinking, what if we started over? Really started over? She paused with the precision of someone who has rehearsed the pause. The money changes everything. We could buy a beautiful house for you wherever you want. The beach, if you like. Florida. Somewhere warm. Fully paid. In your name. No strings. I drank my coffee. And the legal matter, I asked? If we can settle this between ourselves, keep lawyers out of it, I think everyone walks away better. She meant I would walk away with a house in Florida, and she would walk away with $75 million. I looked at her across my kitchen table. In my kitchen, in my house, in the chair where Gerald used to read the morning paper, and I felt something very calm settle over me, the way temperature drops just before a storm clears. "I'll think about it," I said. That was all I said. I finished my breakfast, thanked her again, and went to get dressed. Because here is the thing about that offer. A house in Florida, fully paid in my name, actually had monetary value. It was not nothing. And for approximately 45 seconds, as I stood in front of my closet choosing a sweater, I considered it as a real option. The honesty of that 45 seconds felt important to acknowledge. I am not a person who pretends to be above temptation. But then I thought about what I would be accepting. Not just a house. I would be accepting the premise that my home, my history, and Gerald's porch were worth less than the inconvenience I was causing Christine. I would be accepting that $75 million purchased the right to rewrite what belonged to whom. I would be accepting defeat, not because I had lost, but because the price offered for my surrender was high enough. I put on my blue cardigan and called Ruth. "She made you eggs," Ruth said when I finished telling her. "Very good eggs," I said. "Florida house." That was the offer. Ruth was quiet for a moment. "What did David say?" "I haven't called him yet. I wanted to call you first." "Call him second," she said. "Then come for dinner tonight. I'm making pot roast, and I want you to meet someone." That evening I drove to Ruth's. The someone turned out to be Pastor Carol Fenner from the First Methodist on Lincoln Street, who had been Ruth's friend since choir in the 90s. She was 65, recently retired from her congregation's official duties, but still very much present in the community, and she had, Ruth told me over pot roast, counseled more families through inheritance disputes than most people would believe. "People lose themselves over money," Pastor Carol said, cutting her bread with quiet efficiency. "Even people who seemed perfectly decent before it arrived." "Christine was never perfectly decent," I said. "No," Ruth said. "She was always this. The money just removed the reason to hide it." I told them both everything. The ticket, the legal notice, the threats, the eggs. Carol listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You're doing the right thing, and you're not alone in it. Half this town watched you take those two in 5 years ago, and not once complain. That surprised me." "People noticed?" "Maggie," Ruth said, "we see what we see." I drove home that night, feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Accompanied. Not rescued. Not advised. Simply seen. There were people who knew what had happened in that house, and who would be willing to say so, in whatever form saying so was required. Christine was in the living room when I got back, watching television with Daniel. She looked up when I came in. "Did you think about our conversation?" she asked. "I did," I said pleasantly. "Good night." I went to my room and called David. "Hold the course," he said, when I told him about the offer. "An informal settlement now, without documentation, benefits them entirely. If they're offering, it means they're worried about what a formal proceeding looks like." He paused. "Has she escalated in any other way?" "Not yet," I said. "She will," he said. "When the soft approach doesn't work, they'll go harder. Be ready." I said goodnight and put the phone on the charger. Outside my window, the oak trees Gerald planted were bare now against the October sky. I sat with that view for a long while, the way you sit with something that has always been there, and you have not always understood the full value of. Then I set my alarm and went to sleep. They came on a Saturday, not separately, not casually. Together, and with the particular formality of people who have prepared what they are going to say. Daniel knocked on my bedroom door at 10 in the morning, which he almost never did, and asked if I would join them in the living room. I knew what this was. I had seen it in parent-teacher conferences. The united front, the practiced tone, the agenda dressed up as conversation. I put on my shoes and went. Christine was already seated, hands folded, wearing the gray cardigan again. The careful wife costume. Daniel sat beside her and left me the armchair, which I appreciated for the symbolism, if nothing else. "We want to have an honest conversation," Daniel began. He had clearly written this, or Christine had written it, and he had memorized it. No lawyers, no letters, just family. "All right," I said. "Mom." His voice was softer than I had heard it in years. For a moment, he sounded like himself, like the boy who used to bring me dandelions from the backyard because he thought they were beautiful. "I know things have been hard between all of us. And I know I should have spoken up more. I should have been more." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I'm sorry I didn't protect you better. It was well done." I felt the pull of it, the old attachment, the mother love that doesn't ask to be earned and doesn't disappear cleanly even when it should. I felt it, and I let it be felt, and I did not let it move me. "Thank you," I said. Christine leaned forward. "Maggie, we're not your enemies. We've been living together for 5 years. We've had hard moments, both of us. But at the end of the day, we're all we have. You're a widow. We're your family." She let that breathe. "If this goes to formal dispute proceedings, it will be public. It will be ugly. The Lottery Commission will have investigators asking questions. Neighbors will talk. Is that really how you want the next chapter of your life to look? Fighting your own son in court?" And there it was. Not the Florida house this time. The social threat. She was right that it would be public. She was right that it would be difficult and painful, and that people would talk. She was betting that the prospect of community judgment would frighten me more than losing. It was, I thought, her best argument. I gave it that much. "You said I had no family but you," I said slowly, looking at Christine. "You said the town would talk. But you also told me very recently that I should leave this house and go somewhere with people my own age. You told me you didn't need me." I paused. "Which is it? Am I indispensable family, or am I the elderly charity case you've outgrown?" Christine's composure slipped, not dramatically, just a fraction, the way a carefully arranged surface shifts when something beneath it moves. "That's not fair," Daniel said. "Isn't it?" I looked at him. "Daniel, did you or did you not stand in the kitchen and agree with your wife when she told me to leave?" He didn't answer. "I'm not angry with you," I said, and I meant it. "I'm genuinely not. But I want you to understand why I'm doing this. It's not about the money. It's about the fact that I apparently needed to have money in order for my right to live in my own home to be taken seriously." My voice stayed even. "That's the honest conversation, if we're having one." The room was very quiet. Then Christine stood up. The careful wife costume was gone. Her voice, when she spoke, was clipped and sharp. "You are making a very serious mistake. David Calloway is a small-town attorney handling a case that is going to involve teams of people with considerably more resources. They will document every eccentricity, every lapse, every—" She stopped herself. "We are trying to give you a dignified way out. After Saturday, that offer is gone." "Thank you for letting me know," I said. She walked out. Her footsteps on the stairs were fast and hard. Daniel stood. He looked at me with something that might have been admiration, and might have been grief, and might have been both. "She won't stop," he said quietly. "I want you to know that. When Christine decides something, she doesn't stop." "Neither do I said. He left. I sat alone in the living room for a while after that. My hands, I noticed, were not entirely steady. Let me be honest about that too. I was frightened. The mention of documenting eccentricities and lapses had gone exactly where it was intended to go. I was 68. I forgot where I put things. I talked to Gerald's photograph sometimes, quietly, just to hear myself say his name. Any of those things, framed correctly, could be made to look like something they weren't. I breathed. I stayed with the fear. And here is what I found underneath it. The same thing I had found at 63 when I was first diagnosed with the arrhythmia that turned out to be manageable, and at 44 when Daniel was in the accident that turned out not to be serious, and at 57 when Gerald collapsed in the driveway. I found the place in myself that had always continued, that had always put one foot after the other, regardless of whether the ground ahead was certain. That place was still there. I took out my phone and texted David. They offered a deadline. Saturday. He replied within 10 minutes. Good, means they're afraid of the commission timeline. Stay the course. I'll call you tomorrow. I put the phone down. I looked at Gerald's photograph on the mantel. I had moved it back a third time, and Christine had not moved it again. He looked, as he always looked in that photograph, calm and a little amused, as if he knew something you hadn't quite figured out yet. I know, I said to the photograph. I'm working on it. The Ohio Lottery Commission's dispute mediation meeting was scheduled for a Thursday, 3 weeks after David filed our notice. It was not a courtroom. It was a conference room on the 7th floor of a state office building in Columbus. Beige walls, fluorescent lighting, a long table with plastic water bottles, and a mediator named Gregory Sims, who wore bifocals and spoke with the measured deliberation of a man who had seen many families reduced to their worst elements across tables exactly like this one. Daniel and Christine arrived with 2 attorneys. I arrived with David. Christine was dressed formally, in a charcoal blazer, and she sat with the posture of someone who had already decided how this ended. Daniel sat beside her. He looked at me once when I came in, and then looked at the table, and kept looking at the table for most of what followed. Gregory Sims opened the proceeding by explaining its purpose. This was not a judicial hearing, but a formal dispute resolution process before the commission determined how to proceed with the contested prize claim. Both parties would present their positions. Documentary evidence would be reviewed. The commission had the authority to delay disbursement pending further legal action, or to establish provisional findings that would inform subsequent court proceedings. Christine's lead attorney, a man named Whitfield, from a firm in Cleveland, went first. He was polished and methodical. He argued that the ticket had been given freely and without reservation as a gift. He cited an Ohio appellate case establishing that informal gifts of personal property are legally recognized even without documentation. He argued that my legal notice was an attempt to retroactively rescind a completed gift motivated by a family dispute, not a genuine ownership claim. He used the phrase opportunistic interference twice. He was good at his job. Then David spoke. He was not as polished as Whitfield. He did not try to be. He placed 3 documents on the table: the gas station receipt showing a single card transaction for 2 tickets, my bank statement confirming the charge to my account, and a printed summary of Ohio Lottery Commission Regulation 3770:1-9-08, which establishes that prize entitlement for bearer instrument tickets requires documented proof of purchase in the absence of prior signed transfer. Mrs. Harlow purchased both tickets, David said, with her card, in a single transaction. There is no signed document transferring ownership of the winning ticket to Daniel Harlow. There is no witness transfer. There is no contemporaneous record of any kind establishing that the beneficial interest in the winnings passed from purchaser to recipient. He paused. Mr. Harlow received a piece of paper. That piece of paper has not been legally established as a gift of its associated financial rights. Whitfield objected that the distinction was academic, that gifts of property do not require documentation. David agreed. in ordinary circumstances. But this is not an ordinary circumstance. The asset in question is worth $75 million. The Commission's own regulations require clear evidence of purchase provenance in disputed claims. Mrs. Harlow has provided that evidence. The opposing party has provided testimony. Gregory Sims removed his bifocals and set them on the table. Mrs. Harlow, he said, looking at me directly for the first time. In your own words, what was your intent when you gave the ticket to your son? Every head in the room turned toward me. I had thought about this question for weeks. I had turned it over every morning with my coffee and every night before sleep. What had my intent been? I had given Daniel a lottery ticket on impulse, carelessly, the way you hand someone a piece of gum. I had not intended to give him $75 million because $75 million had not existed yet. I had given him a $2 slip of paper. I gave him a ticket, I said. The same way I might give someone a birthday card. I didn't think about it. I certainly didn't think about prize disbursement rights, because at the time I gave it to him, the ticket was worth $2. I looked at Gregory Sims steadily. If I had handed him $2 in cash that day instead of a ticket, and then that cash had somehow become worth $75 million, I don't believe anyone at this table would argue that the transformation in value was also part of the gift. Whitfield began to object. Christine put her hand on his arm, which meant stop. She leaned forward. This was when she made her mistake. This is absurd, she said. Her voice had shed its professional distance. She was speaking now as herself, without the architecture. She gave him the ticket. He won. End of story. She is trying to steal from her own son because we asked her to be realistic about her living situation. This is spite. Her voice was rising. This is an old woman's spite, dressed up in legal language, and everyone in this room knows it. The room went quiet, in the way rooms do when someone has said the precise wrong thing. Gregory Sims put his bifocals back on. David said nothing. He did not need to. I looked at Christine across the table. Her face was flushed. Her composure, maintained for weeks through breakfasts and living room performances and rehearsed apologies, was gone. What remained was what had always been underneath it. The absolute conviction that she was owed what she wanted, and a genuine inability to understand why the world was not cooperating. Old woman, I said quietly, more to myself than to the room. Daniel finally looked up from the table. His face was pale. Whitfield spent another 40 minutes presenting arguments, but the shape of the thing had changed. The mediator asked several procedural questions. David answered them. I signed 2 additional documents confirming my account and card details. Gregory Sims closed the session by stating that the Commission would issue a formal finding within 5 business days, and that prize disbursement would remain suspended pending that finding. We walked out into the corridor and then the elevator, and then the parking lot, where the November sky was flat and gray and the trees along the boulevard had lost every leaf. Christine walked past me without speaking. Daniel stopped. "Mom?" he said. I waited. He seemed to be searching for something. A sentence, a position, some arrangement of words that would allow him to stand in 2 places at once. He didn't find it. "I don't know how this ends," he said. "I do," I said gently. I got into my car. I sat for a moment before starting the engine. I was not triumphant. Not yet. But I was still. And the stillness felt for the first time in weeks like something that belonged entirely to me. David called on a Tuesday morning, 5 days after the hearing. I was in the garden, cutting back the dead stalks of the coneflowers, cold enough to see my breath. I pulled off my glove and answered. "The Commission issued its finding," he said. I stopped moving. "They ruled in your favor. The purchase documentation was sufficient to establish your ownership interest. In the absence of a signed and witnessed transfer document, they've declined to process Daniel's claim. The prize remains suspended." I stood in my garden with dead flower stalks in one hand and my phone in the other and said nothing for a moment. "What happens next?" I asked. "Their attorneys will advise them that a civil challenge is possible, but the commission's finding becomes part of the legal record and creates a very unfavorable starting position. Given Christine's statement on record." He paused. "Her outburst in the hearing room wasn't helpful to them. It's in the transcript." "I know," I said. "To claim the prize in your name, you'll need to submit your ticket promptly. Can you come to Columbus this week?" "Thursday," I said. I submitted the ticket on Thursday. The verification process took 11 days. During those 11 days, I continued to live in my house on Elm Creek Road. Daniel and Christine continued to live there too. We passed each other in hallways. We did not eat together. The house felt pressurized, like air inside a sealed jar. Christine did not speak to me at all after the hearing. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that this was preferable to the previous arrangement. Daniel knocked on my door one evening. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked. "No," I said, "but thank you for asking." When the commission confirmed my claim, I sat down with a letter David had helped me prepare. A formal notice giving Daniel and Christine 60 days to vacate the property. I delivered it in person to each of them in the kitchen. I set a copy in front of Christine first. She read it without expression. Then she said, "You're really doing this?" "Yes," I said. After everything, I agreed." She stood up and left the kitchen. 30 minutes later, I heard suitcases being pulled from the closet upstairs. Daniel didn't read his copy. He just looked at me. "I understand," he said. And perhaps this is the most complicated part of the story, because Daniel was my son, and I did not stop loving my son. What I stopped doing was allowing that love to be used as a door through which things that were not love could enter my home. That is not the same thing. They were gone in 3 weeks. Whitfield, the Cleveland attorney, withdrew from the case after reviewing the commission's findings and the recorded transcript. Without representation and without a viable claim, the formal challenge faded. On the last morning, Daniel came downstairs with 2 bags. Christine had already taken her things to the car. He stood in the entryway and looked at the hook on the wall, the tiled floor, the staircase he had climbed 10,000 times. "This is really goodbye," he said. "It doesn't have to be," I said. "But it's goodbye to this version." "Yes." He hugged me. I held my son for a moment, and I held him back, and I did not cry, though it was close. Then he picked up his bags and walked out. I watched them drive away down Elm Creek Road, past Gerald's oak trees, and around the bend where the road curved south. Then I closed the door. I went to the kitchen. I put the kettle on. I was alone in my house, and my house was mine. Spring came early that year. I noticed it first in the garden. A green so tentative and pale you had to look carefully to see it, pushing up through the cold ground along the south fence. 20 tulips in red and yellow, and 1 deep purple. I didn't remember choosing, but was glad to have. I stood there in my old coat and felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for a very long time. The prize, after federal and state taxes, came to approximately $38 million. My financial advisor, Patricia Lowe, asked me, in our first meeting, what I actually wanted my life to look like in 5 years. No one had asked me that in a very long time. I kept the house. I had the back porch repaired. Gerald had built it, and it had needed attention for 3 years. When the carpenter was done, I sat out there with coffee and read for 2 hours and felt something very close to complete. I established a scholarship fund through the Denton School District. 3 annual scholarships for graduating seniors going into education. I named it for Gerald. The superintendent cried when I told him. I traveled. Ruth came with me to Portugal in May. We walked along the coast, ate bread with olive oil, drank wine on a terrace above the sea. Ruth said it was the best trip of her life, which made it the best trip of mine. And Daniel? He and Christine separated 8 months after they left my house. What had been underneath their marriage, apparently, was not enough to hold. Christine moved to Phoenix. I don't seek information about her, and none reaches me naturally. Daniel called me in September. I saw his name on the phone and sat with it for a long moment before I answered. "Hi, Mom," he said. "Hello, Daniel." A pause. "I don't expect anything," he said. "I just wanted to hear your voice." We talked for 40 minutes. His work, the weather, nothing remarkable. Before we hung up, he said, "Are you happy?" I looked out the window at the oak trees, full in summer green. "Yes," I said, and it was true. We speak now, occasionally. Not with the same weight of assumption as before, but honestly. More honestly than we had spoken in years. What was destroyed between us was not the love. It was the illusion that love, with no honesty underneath it, is enough to sustain anything real. I had dinner with Ruth that week and told her all of this. She listened, then said, "You know what Gerald would say?" "He'd say I should have fixed the porch 3 years ago," I said. "He'd say that too," Ruth agreed. We laughed, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the oak trees moved in the evening wind, and I was finally, utterly, and without reservation, home. They say that family is everything, and I believe that. I just learned to read the word more carefully. Family is not the people who share your roof. It is the people who see you clearly and stay anyway. It is honesty, even when it costs something. It is love that does not require you to disappear. I planted tulips in the fall without knowing if I'd be there to see them. I was there. Whatever you are facing right now, whatever door someone is trying to push you through, you have the right to ask whose name is on the deed. What would you have done in my place? I'd love to know. Leave a comment, and thank you truly for listening to my story. 1 month after my daughter's wedding, the photographer urgently called me. "Ma'am, I discovered something terrible. Come right now and don't say a word to your daughter." When I saw it, it changed everything. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. The wedding was everything Sarah had ever dreamed of. I remember standing at the back of the reception hall that evening, holding a glass of champagne I barely touched, watching my daughter dance with her new husband. The lights were warm and golden, the music was soft, and Sarah was laughing. Really laughing, the way she used to as a little girl when her father would spin her around the kitchen. I told myself I was crying because I was happy. Mostly that was true. My name is Margaret Holland. People who've known me long enough call me Peggy. I'm 65 years old. I live alone in the house where I raised Sarah in Millfield, Ohio, and I spent 31 years working as a bookkeeper for a regional insurance firm before I retired. My husband, Tom, passed 8 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. After that, it was just Sarah and me. She was the whole point of everything. So when she brought Brandon Cole home 2 years before the wedding, I genuinely tried, to be open-minded. He was handsome in that effortless way that makes you slightly uneasy, the kind of man who always seemed to know exactly what to say. He worked in commercial real estate, talked confidently about investments and market cycles, and had a warm, practiced smile that he deployed like a tool. Sarah adored him. I told myself that was enough. His mother, Linda Cole, was another matter. I met her at the engagement dinner. A slim, well-dressed woman from Columbus who ordered the most expensive wine on the menu and spent the evening talking almost exclusively about her son's accomplishments. She shook my hand firmly, looked me up and down in a way she probably thought was subtle, and said, "Millfield. How quaint," I smiled. I filed it away. The wedding was in September. Small church, 100 guests, a reception at the Millfield Event Center. Sarah wore her grandmother's pearl earrings. I paid for most of it. not because anyone asked me to, but because Tom had left us comfortable, and Sarah was my daughter. The one thing we'd splurged on was the photographer, a young man named Daniel Warren, who came highly recommended. He was professional, quiet, thorough. He shot 12 hours of footage and over 400 photographs. For a month after the wedding, everything seemed fine. Sarah and Brandon moved into the house on Elm Creek Road. Tom's and my old house, which I'd signed over to Sarah as a wedding gift because it was too large for me alone, and I'd already moved into a smaller place on Birchwood. I visited on weekends. I brought casseroles. I watched Brandon accept them with that smooth smile and barely look at me afterward. Then small things began to bother me. I noticed that Brandon had no photographs from before he met Sarah. None on his phone that he ever showed her. None on social media before 2021. No old friends who attended the wedding except two men I'd never seen before or since. When I mentioned it casually to Sarah, she said he was private. When I asked about his previous relationships, she said he'd told her there was one serious girlfriend in his late 20s. Nothing more. Linda, whenever she visited, had a habit of steering conversations away from the past, any past. If I asked something direct, she'd redirect with a compliment or a question of her own. It was skillful. Too skillful. I told myself I was a suspicious old woman who'd watched too many true crime documentaries. Then, 4 weeks after the wedding, my phone rang on a Tuesday morning while I was doing my grocery list at the kitchen table. It was Daniel Warren, the photographer. His voice was strange, tighter than I remembered, controlled, the way people sound when they're working hard not to sound panicked. "Mrs. Holland," he said, "I'm so sorry to call like this. I know it's been a month, but I've been going through the wedding footage for the final edit, and I've found something. Something I don't know how to explain." A pause. "I need you to come to my studio. In person. And please, please don't mention this to Sarah." Not yet. I sat very still at my kitchen table. Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at something. The grocery list was still in front of me. Milk, bread, apples. "When?" I asked. "Today," he said, "if you can." I could. Daniel Warren's studio was on the second floor of a converted building on Grant Street, above a dry cleaner's. I'd been there once before, to drop off the deposit check. The staircase smelled like solvent and old wood. He met me at the door before I knocked. He'd been watching for my car. Inside, the studio was dim, except for the large monitor on his editing desk, which was already lit up with a paused image. Daniel looked like he hadn't slept properly in several days. He was a careful young man. I'd noticed that at the wedding, the methodical way he moved, never rushing. And that carefulness was visible now as he pulled up a chair for me and sat down across from me, before saying anything at all. "I want to show you something before I explain," he said, "because I think it'll make more sense that way." He turned to the monitor and pulled up a photograph. It was from the reception. A candid shot taken near the bar, showing Brandon in profile, talking to one of those two men I hadn't recognized. Brandon was half turned away from the camera, but the other man was visible clearly, and he was holding his phone up slightly, showing Brandon something on the screen. Brandon's expression was the thing, not his usual smooth confidence, something tighter, urgent. "That alone may be nothing," Daniel said, "but look at this." He opened a video clip, footage from the cocktail hour, a wide shot of the room that he'd been reviewing for background ambiance. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, was Linda Cole. She was speaking to the same man from the photograph, close and low, and her hand was on his forearm in a way that wasn't social. It was the way you hold on to something you don't want to get away from. "I ran his face through a search," Daniel said quietly. "I know that sounds like overstepping. I'm sorry, but something was bothering me, and He paused. "His name is Gary Simmons. He's a notary public in Franklin County, and I found his name in a public court record from 2019. He slid a printed page across the desk to me. It was a marriage certificate. State of Ohio. Dated April 14th, 2019. Brandon Michael Cole and a woman named Renata Voss. I looked at the paper for a long time. The dry cleaner's machinery hummed faintly through the floor beneath my feet. "Is there a divorce record?" I asked. My voice came out level. I was grateful for that. "I couldn't find one," Daniel said. "I searched Ohio records, Indiana, Kentucky. Nothing. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Sometimes they take time to index. But Mrs. Holland, I looked for 3 days. I couldn't find it." I sat back in the chair. Here is what I understood in that moment, with the clarity that sometimes comes when the thing you feared most finally has a shape. If Brandon Cole had married Sarah, while still legally married to Renata Voss, then Sarah's marriage was not a marriage. It was a fraud. And the house, Tom's house, the house on Elm Creek Road, which I had signed over to Sarah as a gift, and which was now legally in Sarah's married name. That house was sitting inside a union that had no legal standing. I was a bookkeeper for 31 years. I understood exactly how documents worked. I understood what could happen to property inside a fraudulent marriage when that fraud was eventually unraveled by someone other than us, someone who didn't have Sarah's interests at heart. "Does anyone else know you found this?" I asked. "No," Daniel said. "I called you the minute I decided I had to call someone." I thanked him. I asked him to print everything he had and to store copies somewhere safe. His email, a cloud drive, somewhere outside his studio. I asked him not to contact Sarah and not to contact anyone connected to Brandon or Linda. He agreed. He looked relieved to have handed part of this weight to someone else. I drove home slowly. I did not cry in the car. I saved that for later, standing at Tom's photograph on my bookshelf, pressing my hand flat against the glass because I had to press against something. Then I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where the phone had rung that morning, and I made a list. Not groceries. The kind of list I used to make at work when a file had gone wrong and needed untangling. What I knew, what I didn't know, what I needed to find out, and who I could trust. What I knew: Brandon had a prior marriage on record. No divorce filing found. Linda knew Gary Simmons and had spoken with him at the wedding, meaning she almost certainly knew. What I needed: a family law attorney, a second search of divorce records by someone with professional access, and time, a little time, before Sarah noticed I was pulling at threads. My first call the next morning was to Eleanor Marsh, who had handled Tom's estate. She wasn't a family lawyer, but she would know who was. That was where it started. Eleanor Marsh had been Tom's attorney for 15 years, and mine by extension. She was 71, still practicing, sharp as a paper cut. When I called and said I needed a referral for a family law matter, sensitive, urgent, not something I wanted discussed over the phone, she didn't ask questions. She gave me a name: Patricia Gould, family law, Columbus. 20 years of practice, half of it in cases involving fraud, asset protection, and contested marriages. Eleanor called ahead. I drove to Columbus on a Thursday morning, told Sarah I had a dental appointment, and sat in Patricia Gould's office on the 9th floor of a building that smelled like carpet cleaner and ambition. Patricia was in her early 50s, compact and precise. She listened to everything I said without interrupting. Then she looked at Daniel's printouts for a long time. "What you have here," she said carefully, "is suggestive, not yet conclusive. A marriage record without a corresponding divorce record is not proof of bigamy. It's a gap. Gaps can be filled or they can be real. We need to know which. How do we find out?" I have a paralegal who does exactly this kind of record search. Professional access, multi-state. If there's a divorce filing anywhere in Ohio or adjacent states, she'll find it within a week. If she doesn't find it, Patricia folded her hands. Then you have a much more serious situation, and you'll need to decide how you want to proceed before anyone else does. I authorized the search. I wrote a check. I drove home. The following days were some of the hardest of my life, not because of what was happening, but because of what wasn't. Because on the surface, nothing had changed. I called Sarah on Sunday evening like always. I heard Brandon's voice in the background. I watched my words the way you watch your step on ice. But something had shifted over there too. I sensed it. On Wednesday, Sarah called me. Not our usual evening call, but midday, slightly too casual. She mentioned that Linda had stopped by unexpectedly and had been asking whether I'd seemed off lately, whether I'd mentioned anything worrying. Sarah laughed it off, said Linda was always dramatic, but I heard the edge beneath the laughter. Linda was checking. I didn't know what had tipped her. Perhaps Daniel Warren had been less discreet than I'd asked, looked up something in a way that left a trace. Perhaps Linda simply had good instincts, the kind that come from having managed secrets for a long time. Either way, she was watching now. I said nothing to Sarah. I said I'd been tired, maybe a little quiet, that was all. On Friday, Patricia Gould's paralegal delivered her findings. Patricia called me herself. No divorce filing, she said. Anywhere. We searched Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, West Virginia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Florida, where Renata Voss's last known address was registered. Nothing. Brandon Cole and Renata Voss are, as far as any official record shows, still legally married. I sat down. There's more, Patricia said. My paralegal found Renata Voss. She's living in Sarasota, Florida now. She's not hiding. She still carries the name Voss Cole on 2 of her accounts. And there's something else. A small claims proceeding in Franklin County from 2020, a landlord dispute. The defendant is listed as Brandon M. Cole, and the address given is the same Columbus apartment where Renata Voss was registered at the time. They had been living together as recently as 2020, 1 year after the marriage, 3 years before Brandon met Sarah. Patricia, I said, is this bigamy? If these records are accurate and no divorce was ever finalized, she said, then yes. Brandon Cole committed bigamy under Ohio law. Sarah's marriage is void, and depending on what can be proven about intent, particularly around the property transfer, you may also be looking at civil fraud. The house, Tom's house. What do? I asked. You let me file a formal records request with the Ohio Bureau of Vital Statistics, she said. Official confirmation, that becomes a document. Once we have it, you'll have to decide. Do you go to Sarah first, or do you go to law enforcement first? Either way, we need to move carefully and quickly, because if the other side realizes what you have. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I told her to file the request. Then I hung up and stood at my kitchen window and looked at the yard where Sarah used to play, and I thought about Tom, and I thought about what he would have done. He was a quieter man than me, steadier. He would have said, Peggy, you already know what's right. You're just scared. He was correct. I was scared. But I was also past the point of turning back. The official confirmation arrived on a Tuesday. A letter from the Ohio Bureau of Vital Statistics forwarded through Patricia Gould's office, confirming that no dissolution of marriage between Brandon Michael Cole and Renata Voss had been recorded in the state of Ohio as of the date of inquiry. Patricia had already contacted Florida and received a parallel confirmation. The document was real. The marriage was real. And Sarah's marriage. The wedding, the vows, the certificate on the wall of her kitchen was legally meaningless. I decided to tell Sarah before anyone else could get to her. I called and asked if I could come for lunch on Saturday. Just the 2 of us, I said. I'd bring sandwiches. Sarah sounded pleased. She mentioned that Brandon would be at a client meeting in the morning, that he'd probably be back by early afternoon, and I said that was fine. I'd aim for noon. I didn't tell her to make sure he wasn't there. I didn't want to alarm her, but I timed it carefully. She met me at the door in her weekend clothes, hair loose, looking happy, the specific happiness of someone who doesn't yet know their house is on fire. I hugged her for longer than usual. She noticed. "Mom, you okay?" We sat at the kitchen table. I set out the sandwiches. I let her pour the iced tea. And then, because there was no way to soften what I was about to say that wouldn't just be delay, I told her. All of it. Daniel's call, Patricia Gould, the records, Renata Voss. Sarah didn't scream. She didn't cry immediately. She went absolutely still, the way she used to as a small child when she was working hard to understand something. That same expression, 2/3 concentration and 1/3 dread. Then she looked at the table. "Mom," she said quietly, "are you certain?" "I have the documents in my bag," I said. "Patricia Gould has official copies." Sarah pressed both palms flat on the table. Her eyes filled. She said nothing for almost 2 minutes. Then she asked very quietly, "Did Linda know?" "We don't have direct evidence of that yet," I said honestly. "But the man she was speaking to at the wedding is a notary who witnessed documents in the same county where Brandon's marriage to Renata took place. And she was at the reception, Sarah. She was right there." Whatever Sarah said next was interrupted by the sound of a key in the front door. Brandon came in 40 minutes earlier than expected. He took in the table, the papers Patricia had prepared that I'd laid out, the look on Sarah's face. And his expression shifted in a way I'd never seen before. The smooth surface cracked, just for a second. Then it reassembled into something colder. Behind him, Linda Cole walked in. She hadn't been mentioned. She hadn't been invited. She came in like she had every right. "Peggy?" she said, looking at the papers on the table without looking at my face. "I was hoping we could all sit down and talk about this calmly." "You knew," I said, not a question. "I think," Linda said carefully, "that there are things you don't fully understand about this situation, and that if you take legal action, which I understand you've been exploring, you will cause enormous damage to your daughter that cannot be undone. I'm asking you, as a mother, to let us handle this privately." I looked at her. I thought about Tom. I thought about the house on Elm Creek Road. I thought about the 31 years I'd spent making sure numbers were honest. "What you're describing," I said, "is asking me to help cover up a felony." Brandon leaned forward. His voice dropped to something quiet and specific. He said that if I pursued this, he would make sure certain information about Tom's estate became public. Some accounting question, he said. Something that had always seemed irregular to him. He said it looking directly at me. He said the word irregular. There was nothing irregular about Tom's estate. I knew that down to the cent. But I understood what he was doing. He was telling me he would manufacture something, or try to, and that the process of defending against it would be expensive and exhausting. "That's called extortion," I said. "My attorney will be very interested to hear it." He stared at me. "We're leaving now," I said to both of them. "And if either of you contacts Sarah directly before she's spoken with my attorney, that will be noted and documented." There was a long silence. Then Linda touched Brandon's arm, and they left. Sarah and I sat there for a while afterward without speaking. She was somewhere I couldn't reach yet, working through the particular grief of realizing a person was never who they said they were. I just stayed beside her. I drove home that evening, exhausted in every cell. I spent the next 3 days doing almost nothing. I walked. I slept. I ate soup. I let myself be the age I actually was, just for a little while. Then on day 4, I got up, made coffee, and called Patricia Gould. The call came on a Thursday evening, just as I was washing my dinner dishes. It was Brandon, not Linda, which surprised me. His voice was different from that Saturday afternoon, softer. He said he'd had time to think, that he knew he'd handled things badly, that he was under enormous pressure and had reacted in a way that wasn't fair. He said he wanted to make things right. He used that phrase several times. Make things right. Then he said that he and Linda had discussed it, and that they were prepared to be generous. He used that word carefully, too. He said Sarah would want for nothing, that they would cover whatever legal fees had been incurred, that a settlement could be arranged, that the house could be formally retransferred to Sarah's name in a way that protected her regardless of the marriage question. He said all I had to do was walk back from the legal process. Let it be handled quietly. Let lawyers sort it out privately without involving courts or authorities. I let him talk. I stood at my kitchen window and watched the neighbor's porch light come on in the dusk, and I let Brandon Cole speak for 4.5 minutes without interrupting. Then I said, Brandon, what you're offering me is the same thing Linda offered me on Saturday, dressed up in cleaner language. You committed bigamy. That's a crime under Ohio law. You cannot compensate your way out of a crime by writing a check to the victim's mother. A pause. Sarah is the one you've wronged, I said. And Sarah is speaking with her own attorney now, not just mine. Whatever you have to offer it to her through counsel. Don't call me again. I hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a moment, aware of a very specific feeling that I can only describe as clarity, not triumph. I'd learned enough by then to be wary of triumph before something was truly finished. But a kind of cold, quiet settledness, like a level reading 0. They were watching, I knew, probing for the soft place. Brandon with his reasonable voice, Linda behind him calculating angles. People who operate through manipulation are very good at finding what people want and offering a version of it. What they had misunderstood was that I didn't want anything from them. I wanted what was correct. Sarah had retained her own attorney by then, a young woman named Christine Ibarra, who specialized in family law and had been recommended by Patricia Gould. Sarah was devastated, but she was also angry, and anger, in my experience, is more useful than devastation when there's work to be done. She moved through the initial consultations with Christine the same focused way she'd moved through school, head down, step by step. I worried about her. Of course I worried, but I also knew my daughter. What I needed now was steadiness on my own side. Not just legal steadiness, Patricia had that well in hand, but the human kind, the kind that comes from people who know you and will tell you the truth. I called my friend Dorothea Sims, who had been my closest friend since our children were in elementary school together, and I told her everything. We sat in her living room for 3 hours. She listened, asked practical questions, and at the end said simply, Peggy, you're doing the right thing. I don't want to hear that you're doubting it. I wasn't doubting it, but it helped to hear. I also called my nephew James, who worked in commercial property law in Cincinnati. I wasn't asking him to represent anyone. That wasn't his area, and it would have complicated things. But I wanted a second pair of experienced eyes on the property question. James read the relevant documents and confirmed what Patricia had already told me. The transfer of the house to Sarah existed in a legal gray area that needed to be resolved through the court process, not around it. Any private arrangement Brandon and Linda proposed would, at best, be fragile, and at worst, another layer of fraud. Aunt Peggy, he said before we hung up, whoever told you that you could be bought off with a quiet settlement badly underestimated you. I thanked him and said I was inclined to agree. Dorothea, James, Patricia, Christine, Sarah herself, who was still speaking to me every day, sometimes for an hour, sometimes just to hear a familiar voice. That was my circle. It was enough. Brandon and Linda were quiet for 10 days. I didn't mistake that for retreat. People like that don't retreat. They regroup. I spent those 10 days keeping my schedule. Morning walks, grocery runs, calls with Patricia, being boring, ordinary, unhurried. Because when they came back, and I knew they would come back, I intended to be exactly where I was, standing still, level at zero. They came on a Sunday afternoon, 12 days after Brandon's phone call. I saw the car in my driveway from the living room window, Linda's silver Lexus, which I recognized from the wedding weekend. I watched them sit in the car for a moment before getting out, which told me they'd rehearsed this. The sitting was the last review before the performance. I opened the door before they knocked. Linda was dressed carefully, not overdressed, deliberately not, beige slacks and a plain cardigan, the costume of someone who has come in peace. She was carrying a small bakery box tied with a ribbon. Behind her, Brandon looked exactly as he always had, that easy, handsome calm that I now read the way you read a brand on an animal, understanding it as a mark of ownership rather than a feature. "Peggy," Linda said, "we came to apologize, properly. We should have done this sooner." I stepped back and let them in. Not because I trusted them, I didn't trust them at all, but because I wanted to hear what they'd prepared. And I wanted it to happen in my house, on my ground, where I knew where everything was. We sat in the living room. I didn't offer tea or coffee. Linda set the bakery box on my coffee table like a small peace flag. She began with Brandon. She said he had made a terrible mistake, that the situation with Renata was something he had believed was legally resolved, that a private agreement had been reached, that paperwork had been filed, that apparently hadn't processed correctly. She said this with a kind of mournful reasonableness that I imagined had worked on many people in many rooms. He didn't deceive Sarah intentionally, Linda said. He believed himself to be free. The fault, if there is fault, is in the process, not in his character. I looked at her. I thought about the notary, about the name Gary Simmons, about Linda's hand on that man's forearm at the reception, about the phone records Patricia had been quietly requesting through proper channels. "Linda," I said, "Gary Simmons witnessed Brandon's 2019 marriage certificate. He was at my daughter's wedding, speaking with you, 6 years later. Help me understand how that fits into a story about paperwork not processing correctly." Something moved behind Linda's eyes. She recovered almost instantly, but I saw it. That fractional recalibration of someone who realizes a room they thought they knew the layout of has a wall where they expected a door. "I know Gary socially," she said, "that's all." "Of course," I said pleasantly. Then Brandon spoke. And here is where the mask slipped most clearly, because Brandon was a man who believed ultimately that everything was negotiable, and negotiation was the thing he actually did well. He leaned forward and he said, reasonably, quietly, with the face of someone helping, that he wanted me to consider what a court process was going to cost in time, in money, in what it would do to Sarah publicly. He said he'd spoken to someone familiar with how these cases proceeded in Ohio, and that the property question alone could take 18 months to resolve, during which Sarah could not sell the house or use it as collateral. He said all of this was avoidable. "We can have documents drawn up this week," he said. "Sarah keeps the house, free and clear, a settlement to cover what she's lost. And this ends privately. No one needs to know what happened." I sat very still. I understood what he was offering. Not peace, control. The narrative that he and Linda could live with, and that Sarah would spend the rest of her life holding like a sealed box she was never allowed to open all the way. A private ending is only ever private for the person it protects. "I hear what you're saying," I said, "and I want to say something clearly so there's no misunderstanding. Patricia Gould has already filed a formal complaint with the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office. That process is not mine to stop. Sarah's attorney has filed parallel civil actions. Those are not mine to stop either. This isn't a negotiation I have the power to end, even if I wanted to, which I don't. Linda's composure finally, visibly cracked. Not loudly. She was too controlled for that. But her jaw tightened and her hands pressed flat on her thighs, and she looked at me with a coldness that had nothing performed in it. That was the real Linda. I'd waited a long time to see her. "You're going to regret this," she said. "Maybe," I said, "but I'll regret it honestly." They left. I closed the door behind them and stood in my hallway for a long moment. And yes, I was afraid. A real, physical fear. The kind that sits in your chest like a held breath. These were people who had already demonstrated they would lie and construct and threaten. But the fear didn't unmake anything. If anything, it confirmed it. You are only afraid of people who have something real to defend. And what they were defending told me everything about what they had done. I went to my kitchen and wrote down every word of that conversation, time-stamped, signed by my own hand. I emailed it to Patricia that evening. The Franklin County Prosecutor's Office moved more quickly than I had expected. The complaint Patricia filed had been bolstered by the time it landed on a desk by a considerable dossier. The official vital records confirmations from Ohio and Florida. Daniel Warren's photographs and videos showing Linda Cole with Gary Simmons at the wedding. Patricia's documentation of Brandon's attempt to induce me to withdraw from the legal process. The written record of their visit to my home. And one additional piece of evidence that Patricia's office had quietly secured through proper legal process. Phone records showing 17 calls between Linda Cole's number and Gary Simmons's number in the 6 weeks before the wedding. They had not been careless. They had been careful, and careful people leave a careful paper trail. Renata Voss, contacted through the Florida address on record, had agreed to cooperate. She had not known about Sarah. She had, in fact, believed for years that Brandon was simply estranged. She had heard from him last in 2020, she told investigators, and had assumed the marriage was effectively over. When she learned he had married someone else in 2023, she was, by the investigators' account, quietly furious in the specific way of someone who had suspected something for a long time without having a word for it. She had driven to her own attorney the same afternoon she was contacted. That decision made her a cooperative witness rather than a reluctant one, and it mattered considerably to the shape of the proceedings. The civil hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in February. It was not a criminal trial. That process moved on a separate track. But it was the first formal proceeding in which all parties would be present, and it concerned Sarah's petition to have the marriage declared void and to establish clear title to the Elm Creek Road property. I drove to Columbus the night before and stayed at a hotel 3 blocks from the courthouse. I wanted to be rested. I ordered room service, which I never did, and I sat at the small desk by the window looking out at the city lights and thinking about Tom, and about the kitchen table, and about all the ordinary mornings between then and this one. I wore the gray wool suit I'd worn to Tom's funeral because I believe in showing up to serious things seriously dressed. Patricia met me in the hallway outside the courtroom 20 minutes before the hearing. She was brief and calm. The documentary record was solid. Renata Voss had submitted a sworn statement, and Gary Simmons, who had retained his own attorney as soon as the complaint was filed, had cooperated fully with investigators in exchange for prosecutorial consideration. He had notarized documents he knew were part of a fraud. He had confirmed Linda Cole's knowledge and her direct involvement in planning the deception. All of it was in the record. Brandon and Linda arrived with their attorney, an expensive one from a Columbus firm I recognized the name of, and sat across the room. Linda was impeccably dressed. She looked at me once, briefly, and then away. Brandon did not look at me at all. He looked at the table in front of him and at his hands, and once at the door, in the way of someone doing a quiet calculation about exits. Sarah sat beside Christine Ibarra. She was pale and composed, the way she'd looked at her father's hospital bed. Present, without reserve, because there was no point saving anything for later. I noticed she had worn her grandmother's pearl earrings, the same ones she'd worn at the wedding. I don't know if that was deliberate. Knowing Sarah, it probably was. I sat behind her, one row back. The hearing proceeded. The judge, a woman in her early 60s, reading glasses pushed up to her forehead when she wasn't using them, worked through the documents with methodical patience. She had clearly read the file thoroughly before entering the room, which the quality of her questions confirmed. Brandon's attorney offered several arguments, each one a variation on the theme of procedural incompleteness, administrative delay, good faith belief. The judge listened to each one with complete attention and then asked for the specific filing that would substantiate a good faith divorce filing. The attorney asked for a continuance to locate it. The judge asked how long he had been on the case. He said 6 weeks. She said that was sufficient time to locate a document if one existed, and she would not be granting a continuance. I watched Brandon from my seat. He was, for the first time in my experience of him, visibly unsteady. Not dramatically. He wasn't a man who would permit himself anything obvious in public. But his composure was working too hard. He kept touching his collar. His eyes moved to Linda's face and away again in a rhythm that suggested he needed reassurance she wasn't in a position to give. She was managing her own face with too much concentration to spare any for his. Linda was very still. The stillness of someone who has deployed all their resources and is now waiting to see if they were enough. They were not enough. The judge read her findings in a clear, measured voice, without drama or flourish, which somehow made it more final rather than less. The marriage between Sarah Jean Holland and Brandon Michael Cole was declared void ab initio, void from the beginning, as though it had never legally existed. The property transfer to Sarah was confirmed as unaffected by the void marriage, as it had been a gift transaction from parent to child, properly documented in Sarah's individual name prior to the ceremony. The civil fraud claim would proceed to a separate damages hearing. Criminal proceedings were already underway in parallel. The room was very quiet after she finished. I looked at Sarah's shoulders from behind. I watched her breathe. One slow breath, then another. The pearl earrings caught the light. Brandon's attorney was already leaning toward him, speaking quietly. Linda sat without moving for a long moment, longer than was natural, and then turned and looked at me. Not the calibrated coldness from my living room, but something rawer and less managed. Something that had given up performing. That was the real Linda, and I had waited a long time to see her without the performance in the way. I held her gaze until she looked away. I'm not a cruel person. I didn't feel satisfaction, exactly. I felt the particular exhaustion of a long and necessary thing reaching its proper end. Patricia leaned over and murmured, "That went as well as it possibly could have." "Yes," I said. I reached forward and put my hand briefly on Sarah's shoulder. She put her hand over mine without turning around. That was enough. The criminal process moved at the pace criminal processes move, which is slower than anyone would like and faster than the guilty ever hope. Brandon Michael Cole was charged with bigamy under Ohio Revised Code 2919.01 in March, a fourth-degree felony. Gary Simmons was charged with tampering with records, a third-degree felony, given the deliberate nature of the fraud. Both men entered plea negotiations that spring. Gary moved quickly. He had a family, a business license to protect, and apparently a realistic sense of how the evidence would present at trial. He cooperated fully, confirmed the timeline of Linda's involvement in detail, and accepted a plea that included a fine, probation, and the surrender of his notary commission. Brandon took longer. His attorney attempted several angles that the prosecutor's office declined one by one. He ultimately pled guilty to a reduced filing of attempted deception. Still a matter of public record, still searchable, still the kind of entry that changes how a professional history reads to anyone who looks carefully. 2 years of supervised probation, a fine of $8,000. He stood in a courtroom in Columbus on a Thursday afternoon in April and said the word guilty in front of a judge and a court reporter and whatever composure he had left. I was not in that courtroom. I had said everything I needed to say in other rooms and through other documents. I didn't need to watch. Linda Cole was not charged criminally. There was sufficient evidence to establish her knowledge, but insufficient for prosecutors to demonstrate she had directly participated in the filing fraud beyond a reasonable doubt required for criminal conviction. That was a disappointment. I had been honest with myself about the possibility, and I sat with it for a few days without trying to argue myself out of the disappointment before I let it go. The civil record told the story regardless. Public records have a permanence that doesn't require anyone's cooperation to maintain. The civil damages hearing took place in late April. Christine Abera presented Sarah's case for financial damages resulting from the fraudulent marriage, emotional harm, legal costs, the period during which Sarah's property had been encumbered and effectively unmarketable, and the documented financial losses Sarah had incurred in anticipation of a legal marriage that had no standing. The judge awarded Sarah $62,000 in damages to be paid by Brandon. Whether he would pay it in full or on what timeline was a question Christine would continue to monitor. But the judgment was on the record. It would follow him to any future financial proceeding, any loan application, any property transaction, any professional context where a civil judgment check was run. That was the durable consequence, and it was the right kind. The house on Elm Creek Road was Sarah's, free and clear. The title company confirmed it within a week of the civil ruling, issuing a clean title in Sarah's individual name without encumbrance. I went over on a Saturday morning, and we sat on the back porch together drinking coffee, and the late April sun was exactly right, and Chester the dog was asleep across Sarah's feet. And Sarah said, "I keep expecting to feel relieved, and instead I just feel tired." I told her that was exactly right. That was what real things felt like after they finished, unlike stories, which delivered a clean emotional release at the moment of resolution. Real things left you tired and intact. The tiredness was evidence that it had been real, and the intactness was the victory, even if it didn't feel like one from inside it. She nodded slowly. She understood. Brandon moved back to Columbus. In Millfield, the social process had been quiet but thorough. Word circulated the way it does in a small town, through the particular channels of people who know people who were at the wedding, who read court notices in the local paper, who asked questions and received answers. By the time his plea was entered, Brandon Cole was a name attached to a story in Millfield, and that story had no version in which he was the wronged party. The social world he had entered by marrying Sarah closed behind him like water. His employer in commercial real estate, a mid-sized Columbus firm, had parted ways with him before the plea was formally entered. They had conducted their own due diligence when the charges became public, and the result was a separation described in his paperwork as mutual, which was the professional word for something that was not mutual at all. He eventually found work at a smaller property management company. The position was less prominent. the salary considerably reduced, and the professional ceiling apparent to anyone who understood how reputational damage compounds across time. Renata's divorce was finalized that summer in Florida. She had been his legal wife for 6 years. She received nothing from him beyond the legal dissolution, no assets, no settlement, because there was nothing coherent to divide. What she received was her name back and clarity about what the years had contained. That is not nothing. Linda returned to Columbus and to a life that was perceptibly quieter. I heard, through James, and through the particular way that information moves between people who have been involved in a proceeding together, that several of her Columbus friendships had not survived the publicity. The specific social architecture she had built, the one in which she was a capable, discerning woman whose son was a success, had been substantially revised. She was not in poverty. She was not in legal jeopardy. But she was operating in a reduced world, which for someone like Linda, who had built her identity around expansion and management, was its own particular consequence. Daniel Warren, the photographer, was the reason any of this had happened. I sent him a formal letter, and I also called him. I told him that what he had done, that decision to pick up the phone, to act on what he'd found rather than tell himself it wasn't his business, had changed my daughter's life. That his instinct to do the right thing had been worth more than he probably knew at the time he acted on it. He was quiet on the phone for a moment, and then he said he was glad. He sounded young and sincere, and I believed him completely. I referred 3 wedding bookings his way that year through friends and clients. It seemed small. It was the best I could do. Eleanor Marsh called me in May to ask how things had resolved. I told her the summary. She was quiet for a moment. "Tom would have been very proud of you," she said. I put the phone down for a full minute after that. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at his photograph on the bookshelf, and I let myself feel it properly. When I picked the phone back up, I said, "He would have said I took too long to get started." Eleanor laughed. A real laugh, surprised out of her. "That sounds about right." Autumn came to Millfield in the way it always did. Slowly and then all at once. The maples along Birchwood turning from green to amber almost overnight. The smell of wood smoke from somebody's fireplace finding its way through my kitchen window on weekend mornings. The light changed. The air sharpened. The town settled into the particular rhythm of a place that has existed long enough to know what it is. I settled into my life with a gratitude I'd forgotten was available to me. After Tom died, I had become careful. Not depressed. I want to be precise about that, because there is a difference, and the difference matters. Careful in the way of someone who has lost the other half of an arrangement they relied on completely, who does things correctly and safely and without much spontaneity, because spontaneity had been Tom's department, and without him it felt irresponsible. I had kept the grocery list. I had kept the schedule. I had kept the careful shape of a life without fully inhabiting it. What happened with Sarah and Brandon had, oddly, broken that open. There's nothing like being genuinely tested to remind you that you have capacities you'd stopped calling upon. I had made decisions under pressure. I had sat in rooms with people who frightened me and not shown it. I had followed a thread I couldn't see the end of and trusted myself to handle what I found. And I had. That was available to me again now as a fact I knew about myself. That fall, I started a small bookkeeping consultancy, part-time, entirely by referral, working with small businesses in the county that needed quarterly help and couldn't afford a full accountant. I charged a reasonable rate, worked from my kitchen table 3 mornings a week, and found that I had genuinely missed the particular satisfaction of making numbers tell the truth. There is a quietness to correct accounting that I have always found steadying. The way a balanced ledger simply is what it is, without ambiguity or performance. Dorothea referred the first 2 clients. Eleanor Marsh referred a third. Within 6 months, I had a quiet, manageable practice that earned me enough to take a trip to Portland in the spring to visit a cousin I hadn't seen in 4 years. We walked along the waterfront for 2 days and talked about our lives properly, which we hadn't done since our 30s. I joined the book club Dorothea had been trying to recruit me into for 3 years. We read things I wouldn't have chosen myself and argued about them with a cheerful ferocity that I found unexpectedly restorative. I planted tomatoes and basil in a small raised bed in my backyard. The tomatoes were modest but real. The basil was extravagant. I was, to summarize, living. Actually living, not maintaining. Sarah, by the following spring, had begun to emerge from the long interior work of recovery in a way that was visible and specific. She accepted a promotion at the architectural firm where she worked. Project lead on a regional civic building, the kind of work she had been aiming toward for years. More responsibility, more visibility, considerably better pay. She refinanced the Elm Creek Roadhouse in her own name alone. Strong credit, stable income, no complications of any kind. And I watched her sign the final documents over video call with the expression of someone setting down a book they'd read against their will, permanently, on a high shelf. She met Marcus the following autumn, a quiet, precise engineer who had moved to Millfield for a position with a regional infrastructure firm and knew almost nobody in town. He moved through rooms like he was thinking about load-bearing walls, which I mean as a compliment. He was steady and genuinely funny in a way that took a while to notice, and he was careful with Sarah in a way that looked like consideration rather than caution. I liked him immediately. I waited 8 months before I told Sarah. She said she'd known since the first dinner, when he fixed my back door handle without being asked and without mentioning it afterward. Chester, the golden retriever, extended him a provisional tolerance that gradually became something indistinguishable from devotion. As for Brandon and Linda, I thought about them less than I expected. Brandon was employed below his previous level, legally encumbered, operating in a narrower world. The civil judgment sat on his record. Linda had returned to Columbus to a quieter life in which several friendships had created distance, and the projects she'd spent years managing were in public ruins. I imagined she'd found a way to frame it as someone else's fault. I did not imagine it brought her peace. On a Saturday in late October, Sarah and Marcus came for dinner. I made Tom's chicken and dumplings. Sarah brought apple wine. Marcus arrived with farm stand flowers, slightly unruly, last of the season. We ate at the kitchen table, the same table where the call had come in, where I'd made the list, where I'd had my coffee the morning I decided to stop being afraid. The leaves were down. The porch light was on. Chester was asleep with his chin on Marcus's shoe. Sarah was talking about the civic building project, the way light would move through the entrance in winter. And she was animated and present and fully herself. I sat at my table and listened to my daughter's voice. That was everything. That was entirely enough. I didn't set out to be brave. I set out to be accurate. There is a difference between those two things, and I think it matters. A photographer made a phone call he didn't have to make. A paralegal searched records no one had asked her to search before. I wrote a list at a kitchen table instead of closing my eyes and hoping. None of that was heroic. All of it was necessary. If you had been sitting where I was sitting, if it had been your daughter, your house, your family, what would you have done? I think I know. That's why you stayed until the end. Thank you for listening.